Hi guys, Ken Humphreys here. In my career as a debunker of the Jesus fable, I've often found that atheists and humanist groups are among the staunchest defenders of the supposed historical Jesus. It's almost as if they rush to recruit the hero of the New Testament as an all-round good guy and supporter for their humanist cause. If they are libertarians themselves, their Jesus is a strong advocate of personal freedom, resisting authority and the powers that be. If they are of a socialist or left-wing persuasion, Jesus speaks for the common man and the rights of the community. Their Jesus is 90% supposition and 10% selectively chosen biblical passages and memories from their childhood. Earlier this year, I spoke with one such group. I was late to join the meeting, and the group themselves discussed in a friendly and informative way their thoughts about Jesus. As you will hear, almost to a man and woman, they had already concluded, of course, was that he existed, but with equal certainty, he wasn't the Son of God. So I'm sharing this discussion with you and hope that it brightens your festive season.
I'll be interested in your conclusions. It's quite a nice way of, rather than me delivering a message like an Old Testament prophet, if you tell me what you've discovered, having talked about it rationally, I guess.
What did we conclude, David?
Well, I concluded that there was pretty good evidence that Jesus has existed, although I will grant you that there's very little written evidence. That would be putting it in a nutshell.
Very little written evidence, but good evidence. Okay.
And I would sort of go along with that. I think probably enough disinterested evidence that he existed, but whether he was the Son of God doesn't fit in with my worldview. So.
Fair to say that you were an unbeliever, but you feel that there was some person called Jesus.
Oh, well, I think there was definitely a Jewish rebel.
Jewish rebel, right? Okay.
A rebel by the name of Jesus. I think that's probably what I would currently believe. Believe it's a theory, but not a scientific theory.
I'd rather go with the Alan Watts idea that Jesus tries to say in the Bible that we're all sons of God, and he says, "Isn't it written in your prophecies that you are all sons of God?" Jesus was a bloody brilliant bloke, but the Christians went and pedestalized it, thereby undermining the so-called good news that he was supposed to bring, which is that, hey guys, you're all sons of God. So I think that I go with that one.
Okay. And I presume that the others, you had various variations on that. You sort of think that a nice guy or something or other, yeah?
I'm saying nothing.
I'd say nothing, right? Okay.
So he was an apocalyptic prophet.
Okay, the Bart Ehrman sort of solution. Yeah, okay.
Karen, what did you want to say? You think?
Yeah, it's just the sort of, it's a bit like an onion with all the layers. There might be Jesus as a good guy in the middle, and then there's all the things that are added by all the beliefs and all the stories that go around him. I mean, I'm thinking particularly if you start thinking about Christmas, if you start thinking about the virgin birth, is that consistent with Jesus? And if that's a lot of nonsense, does that discount the idea of Jesus?
Yeah, you're getting dangerously analytical when you talk like that. Yeah, you're absolutely right, of course, absolutely right.
I think there was Jesus, and I think he was this chap who could talk to people like a psychologist and actually make them get better because it was all in their mind and they would get better. And then he became well known. And later on, years later, Paul put a spin on him and made him amazing.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that you have all these ideas, and they're around profusion, variations on who he really was, that they exist in great profusion. It might help if I say how I came to this, because Some people imagine, because my website is called Jesus Never Existed, my book is no less emphatic, Jesus never existed. It's like, oh, he's a hot-headed anarchist, a denier of reality, because he's so hostile to religion. You know, that's what people often conclude. They have a psychological interpretation of me. Let me just say, most of my life, I thought Jesus existed. I grew up in Britain,
Went to a
school that had Christian services for sure and all the rest of it. And to be honest, and to my eternal shame, I also got married in a church. But so I wasn't hostile per se to Jesus. I was sympathetic to the idea of a Jewish rebel trying to sort of throw off the imperial Romans. So I was sympathetic to the idea of Jesus. But I never believed in Son of God. I mean, I'd go with most of you if you think that, because I felt God doesn't exist, so let's not get silly about this. There's no Son of God. You might say, theoretically, we could argue we're all sons of God, but okay, so I wasn't hostile to Jesus, and in fact, I wasn't particularly interested in religion. When you don't believe, why would you be interested in it? You're only interested in it for its negative effects. The negative effects draw you into taking an interest in religion. When I started, my intention was to write a book on the Dark Ages because I was fascinated by the collapse of ancient civilization. I came from a situation where thinking, well, Christianity probably began with Christ. I mean, it's sort of logical, isn't it? Christ, Christianity. And so that is the route which many people can go down because it's the default route. You believe what the religion of your host country. I mean, you grow up in Britain, you're likely to be a Christian, and you don't challenge things that are told to you as a child. We all know the effectiveness of telling someone when they're very young, well, this is the truth. Jesus was a nice man, and you better do what your mummy says. It's a control mechanism. So, okay. If the churches ever stopped indoctrinating children, they would find their membership dwindled to almost negligible levels. All the stories are accreted. For centuries, it wasn't so enlightened, and religion was a cause of so much suffering. For 100 years, there were continuous church councils where they were trying to hammer out what they believed. One of the Christians they believed already, they had to agree what they were going to believe. So there was a series of doctrines came along, and they were quite acrimonious and violent. And it's the whole story of humanity, really. The whole story of humanity. But so then I started to do some research into the Dark Ages and starting to question where we get these ideas from about Jesus. What do we actually know? You think, at least I thought, I don't know if you thought, you could go to some secular source of a history about Jesus. You could find a reference to, a little potted history that maybe some Roman wrote somewhere or some Greek or somebody. But no, you don't find that. And that starts to raise a question about where do these ideas come from, and can we genuinely believe them? Now, I think we have an issue, and possibly it affects us all, that you by default will be favourable towards a Jesus idea. That's what I've found over the years, talking with humanists and atheist groups and secular groups, that they have a generally a positive view of Jesus as a man. And it's rather interesting. One of the early investigators of the Jesus story, when historians began to search for an historical Jesus, never mind the Jesus of faith, they make this distinction. There's a Jesus of faith, we just believe this. But there's an historical Jesus we have to look for. People began to say, and one of the earliest such inquiries came to this conclusion: people who find Jesus are like those looking down a well and they see a reflection of themselves at the bottom of that well. And that is a way you might perceive how people see Jesus. And I've noticed that secularists quite often perceive a secular Jesus. humanists perceive a humanist Jesus. You know, he's got similar values to themselves. He's like them. He's like them. But that is no more than their particular variation on the theme that a crusading Jesus would see Jesus as a crusader with his shield and sword. Jesus has presented himself in many guises, but it's very close to the human spirit that where he comes from and what it genuinely represents. Now, when you come to the point of trying to historical evidence, and this is where I started to see red flags, you don't find anything. You don't find anything. And that is really disturbing. Okay, turn to the Gospels. Yes, you get the New Testament version of Jesus. But that, as everyone will tell you, as you would know yourself, is not a history book per se. It has bits of history in it. It's designed to help you believe, as the Gospel of John says. It's to help you believe. So it's a very questionable source, and it certainly can't be regarded as a historical source. Now, when you look for historical sources, do you find them? Well, I can tell you, you don't. And I have spent 20 years of my life pursuing Jesus of Nazareth, right? And with each passing year, it becomes more and more certain that there is no such character, and there never was. But what we have is layers of accretion of information that, for some people, I suppose, gives them comfort. They find a bolt hole for their particular Jesus, and they close their mind around it. So when I've talked to Christians, it's surprising how little they know about the history of the Christian church. They just do not study their own history in any detail at all. In fact, perhaps I've been unfortunate, but many Christians I've spoken to don't even know their own Gospels. They don't really know them. It's sufficient to talk about them, but they do have their faith. They do have their faith. So despite all the historical or rational evidence one might present to them, they retreat into this castle of faith. And you just can't budge that if they are so determined. The people who are grateful for what I've written and presented to them, and it's really quite extensive what I've written and put on the web, and what most people find now more useful as a resource is the YouTube videos that I produced. There's I think over 200 videos on the Jesus Never Existed YouTube channel, and they're very popular. Some of them are quite short, 5-10 minutes. Some of them are up to an hour, but they do provide people a way of gaining information outside this fortress mentality that I've got my faith and I don't want you coming along and disturbing it.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
Just about how historical sources from 2,000 years ago work. I mean, history per se wasn't really a thing, was it? And we were just hearing about Josephus, which we thought did talk about Jesus. So are you saying Josephus doesn't talk about Jesus, or else that he's too late to count?
Josephus is a very important resource. Yes, he gives chapter and verse very extensively on the history of the Jews. I mean, you can probably, if you've discussed it, if you've discussed Josephus, you know that he fought war against the Romans and then went over to the Romans. He became part of the entourage of Vespasian. He went to live in Rome, and he wrote a history of the wars, and then subsequently he wrote a history of the Jews. And of course, his reports on the wars did tend to give a glowing report of General Vespasian. I mean, that's not too surprising. And the Jews regarded him as a renegade. I mean, we only have Josephus because the Christians copied him. The Jews didn't copy Josephus, the Christians did. Okay. And it's a very... Now, did Josephus know Jesus? Well, I don't think so, because he was born, if memory serves me, 57, or is it
37?
Something like that. I'll have to check it out. But he wasn't even born when Jesus was supposedly crucified. He wasn't even born, so he didn't know him. So the incredible thing about this reference that's often made to Josephus is how brief it is. I've got a copy of Josephus I can show you. It's quite a thick book. And there's a paragraph in there where he refers to Jesus, right? But he's actually talking about the building of an aqueduct in Rome. And he breaks off this dialogue about the building of an aqueduct in Jerusalem. He breaks off this discourse to say, and there was about this time, there was another misfortune for the Jews. And in one single paragraph, he says just about everything that a Christian would want him to say. And then he goes back to talking about the aqueduct. And quite rightly, rationalists regard this as an interpolation. It's a Christian interpolation. They translated the whole book. They were disheartened to find that Josephus didn't give paragraphs or chapters to Jesus, but they squeezed in between a couple of paragraphs about civil construction work, a reference to Jesus being the wonderful man. And it's so glowing, it could not have been written by an Orthodox Jew, which Josephus was. So the more recent interpretation of Josephus is that it's been partially interpreted. In other words, the Christians have sort of massaged what he put something there. It wasn't very nice, so they've tidied it up a little bit. But it's only an attempt to paste over an obvious embarrassment, because Josephus didn't spend time talking about Jesus, and nor did any other Jewish historian. And there were a few around. And there were Romans around, and like Tacitus and Suetonius. There were such people around, but they don't speak about Jesus. There are questionable references being inserted into both their works, but they are not convincing. And I assure you, there are volumes of information about that on the internet. So, sorry, that was a question about Josephus, yes?
Yes, thank you very much. Very interesting.
Isn't it easier to talk about somebody who's real and alive than somebody you're just making up a story? Surely.
Yeah, right. Here you have an issue then. Here you have an issue. How do you get people to believe a complete story about a fictitious character? How do you do that? That surely you can only really talk about somebody who did exist. That would be where the rationale comes from. It must have been real because they wouldn't have believed it otherwise. But you've got to understand the nature of construction of social myths, particularly religious myths which have been developed by a people decimated by war, which is what happened with the Jews. So that is the context. Now, you don't invent the entire story wholesale. So you have obvious developments taking place. For example, in the first of the Gospels, first constructed, that is, not the first that presented. First of the Gospels was Mark, right? Now, Mark begins his story with Jesus being a man, fully grown man, who goes to John the Baptist. Now, there is no reference in the Gospel of Mark to the Nativity. That only comes along later. So you can see how you begin to get sort of mismatches between what is written in an earlier story and later additions. That's why the Gospels never quite tie in with each other, right? Because as with the passage of time, the story is developed, and ideas that were fashionable at one point in time go out of fashion, and other ideas come in. So that is what's occurring now. So, do you have to start with a man? Well, what do you say about him in the first instant? What is the first thing you say? Well, it doesn't necessarily have to be a reference to a real man. And in fact, with Jesus, it isn't particularly, because these instances where so for example, going to the baptism and perambulating around the sea of the so-called Sea of Galilee, they're merely a device for imparting other bits of wisdom. They're not convincing evidence of any real thing. the one that comes to my mind is where Jesus takes James and John and Peter up to the top of the mountain, right? And what happens, of course, is God speaks, I think, in a cloud, and you have the apparition of Moses and Isaiah, and Peter is confused. He talks about building them a little tent or something. And so, but if you take that instance, which sounds really quite bizarre in any way or form, you have to say, well, if it wasn't real, what really happened then? Did one day Jesus go up to the top of a mountain for a nice walk and come down again? You see, these stories only work when they've got a theoretical message with them.
Sorry to interrupt, but are we talking about a myth here, really? It's the development of myths and legends about somebody. But
Absolutely.
in parallel with that, there might be just a regular man, a regular Joe, or Jesus in this case, who does exist. He might be a fisherman. He might. His dad might have been a carpenter, not dad, not God. But all the historians that might have written then would have kind of ignored him, and he might not have been the Jesus that we're thinking of. But in fact, there might have been a real Jesus in that way. In fact, there might have been several of them. There might have been 50 Jesuses. But the thing that's got traction is the myth.
Yes, absolutely. You win with a prize there, Karen. That is exactly what happens. If you start off with the idea, well, he was a real regular guy and nothing special, you have an issue of, well, why would you remember him? You know, what is it about him? And was he a carpenter or a son of a carpenter or a fisherman or whatever he was? Was he that or was he something else? And is he still Jesus if he was actually, I don't know, a house painter? And his mother wasn't Mary, but Martha. What I'm saying is there would have been, and in fact there were, thousands of Jesuses. In fact, not actually Jesus, because the J wasn't in use at that time, but Yeshua. There were various Yeshuas, and it was a very common Jewish name. For example, if you take the high priests of Jerusalem, 4 of them in the first century had the name Jesus. 4 of them out of 16. 4 of them had, that's 25% of the high priests were called Jesus. So it's not the fact that a man, that yes, we can jump to the other side and say, there were lots of them. There were lots of people called Jesus. So which one are then you going to say, that's the one we've chosen to be amplified into Jesus of Nazareth, Son of God? You'd have to say, well, hang on, he's got to have done something, or they wouldn't notice him. If he does, it's not noticeable at all. So then you have to ask, well, what is it that he did that was noticeable?
If you go with that, we were talking before you came about the way the Ahmadiyya Muslims believe that Jesus studied in India in his 20s and then worked in Iran on the way and then got kicked out of Iran. But I guess you'll know more about this, in fact, because I was under the impression that the Isa, which is what the Muslims call him, did actually show up as a fairly learned prophet in the Iranian records around the time. But I may be wrong, because I haven't looked into it as much as you.
Well, you're right and wrong. I mean, yes, this name Isa exists in Arabic, and yes, there are so many stories about Jesus. This is the thing. The story has been carted off in every direction. I mean, there's even a tradition about Jesus going to Japan. Now, can you imagine somebody from the Middle East in the first getting up in the mountains in India, even in Glastonbury? This guy has been moved around and made sort of special, but where is the reality of it all? Yes, there might have been people with that name. Some of them might have been fishermen. Some of them might have been carpenters. Probably a lot of them had a mother called Mary, the most common Jewish female name. And so you think, okay, we've got loads and loads of Jesus, possibly. are we saying that, well, only one of them was the real Son of God, but he didn't get noticed by anything at the time? And then you start thinking, that sounds more like a myth that's being created, and it has been amplified generation by generation and then taken off by cultures in different directions. We know, I've seen pictures of a black Jesus from Zimbabwe. Jesus is melded into whatever people want him to be. That's the point. And you have to say, well, where did it all begin? Did it actually begin with a man? Why would it need to begin with a man? You're talking of somebody comes to earth as the Son of God. I mean, that's really the God decides to place himself in historical time in the guise of Jesus, but he doesn't hang around very long, and he disappears again. Now, do you actually need a man to plant that idea on somebody? Because what's that going to happen? You're going to start off, as you probably did, as I did. People, when you're a child, tell you the story. You learn the story before you start looking at any history. You learn the story. You know the story by heart. And so where can we get any credibility for a real Jesus? Because every single story you look at, take one that I'm particularly fond of, the one that comes nearest to a reality, the overturning of the temple. You remember the story, turning of the temple? And you think, okay, let's go with that one. Jesus does it single-handedly by the biblical account. The temple, if you don't already know, at that time was a huge structure of covering 35 acres in central Jerusalem. The temple court, where their money changes were, was an actual official part of the Jewish temple structure. People had to use an acceptable coinage. Their contribution to the temple and their payment for animals had to be made in a certain coinage, so they had to have it changed over. So these were legitimate businesses, and yet supposedly Jesus, with a handmade whip, he manages to go in there, drives out the animals, and he overturns the tables, and he walks away. And as the gospel tells you, from that point on, the priests planned to kill him. Now, do you think, given the thousands of people that would be milling around the temple, the hundreds of money changers, the temple guards, somebody could have just gone in there with his whip and started turning things over, and he would escape with his life? I mean, he didn't even get arrested. It's just...
I don't think we're really... I think most of us here will probably buy into the basic premise that you're making, which is that a lot of the stories are not in any particular way historical. But I think that the point that I still find, I think, yes, that he is probably an archetype, but I agree with whoever said it earlier that it's almost easier to believe that he was based on some kind of historical figure than that he was entirely conjured out of thin air. Although I know from there's a theory at the moment that Muhammad also was created years later to fit with the thing. So I mean I don't know. Maybe it just.
Well, okay,
it's very hard to prove a negative. That's the problem.
Well, that is the point. And what we come down to, of course, is probability. Probability. At the end of the day, a lot of historians who write about this historical Jesus, they come to the conclusion he probably existed. It's a nice little comment you can get away with. You're not upsetting anybody, because if you hit the nail on the head like I do, he never existed. People will be hostile. They will, because it's easy. Like you said, it's easier to believe that it was somebody than actually the horror story of realizing it's all a fabrication. But that doesn't mean it wasn't all a fabrication. It's just that we have difficulty taking that on board, that for 2,000 years we've all been taken to the cleaners, and often nations have been destroyed and bodies have been heaped up in mountains because of this bogus idea. But then as you just said, it's almost probably so that Muhammad was an invention. Much more convincing evidence when you start looking at Muhammad and thinking, this doesn't sound like it really originated down in Mecca. It really sounds like it came from the areas nearer to the central areas of the Middle East, like Damascus and Jerusalem. And it sounds like it was much later than this Muhammad guy. But they created him because he was the guy that they could present as the front for their religion. So, yes, I don't have any problem saying to people, these are all fraudulent ideas. I don't think there's any chance of a God coming to earth. And I don't think anyone really seriously met somebody and they were so convinced that he had miracle powers. That's what they believed. They started to believe little bits of a story, and then each new generation, they added other bits to that.
Oh, what I wanted to say as well, that I read a long time ago that the name Jesus of Nazareth, that Nazareth didn't actually exist until the 3rd century AD. So, that was another claim that name was sort of made up. And when I was studying history a long time ago, and my lecturer, she was amazed. I mean, she would completely agree with you, because she was amazed that historians are so good at looking at their primary sources and analysing it. And I said, why are they not asking any questions about Jesus, about his existence at all? And what you say, a lot of them accept it because they think, well, so what, let people believe what they want to believe. But they did not really analyse any primary sources at all, so it seems, while they're so good at doing all the other stuff.
Yeah,
So,
well, again, that is a cardinal point. Yeah, a cardinal point. The historians don't particularly want to write about Jesus. There's no particular mileage in it, because you think of the hostility you'd get from the southern states in America, right? I was invited over there to do a tour at one time, but a little bit of a risk that I wasn't prepared to take. There you've got believers who will kill. If they could shoot doctors in abortion clinics, they could certainly shoot somebody who's saying their religion is hogwash. What do we do if we are secularists and humanists and we're committed to rationality? You can't compromise on such issues because your opponents are so hostile, and they are, because of course they think they're going to heaven, they think they're going to be with their loved ones. They don't want people to point out it doesn't fit together. It's made up of holes. A heavy lift. It's a heavy lift.
Any more questions?
Yeah, I was just thinking that the people who are, the dyed-in-the-wool evangelists, and they believe that all this has happened, but all this is based on faith. It's not sort of real. Mm-hmm. And there must be some people in that population who believe that they've actually seen Jesus, or Jesus came into the room, or the second coming actually happens. That hasn't happened. There's been no proof of that ever having happened, but nobody sort of examines that at all. Nobody expects it to happen, and yet they're so they believe in it so fervently. And I can only think that it is just that it's a kind of castle of faith, really, and rationality is just not allowed in. But you would think that they would like to say, I saw Jesus in my kitchen. He said, oh yes, I remember God, and that sort of thing. And it just kind of won't happen. But you'd think somebody's expecting the second coming. They're talking about the second coming. But if it actually happened, would anybody believe it?
I've come across Christians who quite happily smile at me and say, yeah, but Jesus cured my husband's cancer. I prayed to him, he got better. Okay, the hospitals might have played a little bit of a role in it, but it's Jesus who gets the credit and strengthens their faith. It strengthens their faith. You can point out that why are the 12 disciples so unknown? Oh, I don't know, but it doesn't really matter. I've got Jesus, and it's quite interesting because everybody knows what Jesus looks like. Isn't that marvellous? The entire world knows what Jesus looked like. He's sort of slightly above average height, slim guy, long hair, long lank hair, and we all know that, and you think, well, how do we know that? The Gospels don't give any description of Jesus. None at all. None at all.
presumably abstract once one gets beyond the simple book religion. Well, that's how I would imagine it. I don't know. The trouble is, not having been brought up without a religious background, I'm having to imagine what people feel. So I might be giving them more credit than they deserve.
Are hijacked by a sort of God is entirely man-made and everything comes after is man-made, and therefore why are we having these conversations?
Yeah, okay. I'm with you in many ways on what you've said there. Firstly, about this, we have rednecks. I talk a lot to rednecks, but nearly all of them are in the States. I find in the UK there's a rather satisfying disregard of religion. People don't really waste their time on it. And I actually have struggled at times to find a Christian to debate with me. Because even if I find someone who claims to be a Christian, they don't know the gospel or the church history well enough to debate. And yes, when I've discussed with occasionally with churchmen, I mean, you'd be amazed how much they disagree with the biblical story.
I've just spent a month in Saudi Arabia. I tried to broach the subject a couple of times, and it was like, end of conversation.
Yeah, of religion, or were you talking about Islam? We're trying to get them to talk about Islam.
Yeah, but I spent a lot of time in Texas.
Okay, yeah.
I mean, the only time I get any discussion is when I meet a Mormon, because they immediately try to want to convert me, in which case I go, okay.
Yeah, I agree. And I'd say the same for Jehovah's Witnesses. I mean, most people shut the door on them, but I invite them in. Yeah, we have long discussions. Yeah, and that's fine. But of course, they have to retreat into faith in the end and say, "Well, you just don't believe it, do you? You just don't believe it." But and then they come back to some experience that they've had. It's usually people have had. Well, they would describe what do they sort of a second coming. They've been touched by a religious experience. So they're born again. They're born again. You see, and and I've tried with, and these are sometimes intelligent people, I've tried to get them to explain it, but they almost won't explain it. It's sort of personal to them. And it's sort of like, it was at night and I was alone, but I can't go into it. It was, and you're down to a battle against woo, aren't you? You're just all this spooky stuff. There was an occasion when I was challenged by a believer to pray, right? To pray. And I said, oh, come on, how can I pray? I don't believe it. He said, oh, it doesn't matter. If you pray, you've got to do it out loud and God will answer you, right? So I thought, well, in the interests of academic study, I will do what he says. Okay, so he gave me the prayer. I said this prayer and I waited. And eventually I'd ask him, well, look, I've not heard anything from God like yet. What was he going to do? And the answer was, you will know when he does whatever it is he does. You think, okay, so that's your get out. So if I was so minded to think, well, he's going to trip me up on the pavement or make my grandmother sick or something, but I've got to put in the notion that I'm going to then believe. Such a self-serving sort of idea that prayers will be answered, but you can't say which way they'll be answered. It's all up to God, isn't it?
But don't you think that, again, that is a way in which religious people have misunderstood their own teachings, in that prayer, if prayer is done properly, prayer is a very powerful thing, because prayer is giving thanks. And if all you do is give thanks, particularly, I don't think there's some God to hear it, but the thing is to give thanks. Because of the structure of the English language, we tend to think we give thanks to something. And I wouldn't mind betting the first person that came up with this idea of God was like, just be thankful. And someone said, who shall I be thankful to? And so again, very Monty Python, but just be thankful.
Prayer's also useful. It has a use, even if you think it's nonsense in terms of talking to. It also has a use, putting something, almost siding a problem, putting it on the back burner. Well, I can't do anything about this issue, but I'll just put it there, and it stops you worrying about it. So I think it's very a lot of people in that sort of way, that it's almost as if they're giving the problem to somebody else.
There's all kinds of psychological advantages in believing in a religion. There certainly is. Have we resolved any outstanding issues? Let me leave you with a challenge. If you think there is still a man behind the legends, do send me that information and I'll track it down.
Well, thanks very much, Ken. And
well, I've enjoyed it.
Thank you very much, Ken.
Jesus is a friend.
Thank you very much. Thank you.